For this project, we'll be learning about the value scale, how to mix out these different values, and how to apply the paint in 4 different and distinctive ways. We'll start off with talking about how to adhere canvas down, followed by mixing paint on your palette, and finally paint application.
Okay, so we are taping down a canvas from our canvas pad. We're going to be doing this all semester, so you need to know how to do this. First, you need to have a piece of cardboard. So your kits are coming in boxes. Save that box and cut the cardboard. Use it to mount your canvas pads onto. We'll be using these frequently for both projects and for our homework. You need your blue painter's tape. And then for this value scales project specifically, I'm using a ruler to measure out the lines from my value scale, and I have a pencil to also draw out those lines. You don't need to use a ruler. It doesn't need to be a beautiful, perfect grid. All I care about is that you have 10 distinctive values and that you have 4 columns to address these different paint applications. Anyway, so let's get started. Now, we're going to fully tape each side. Don't try to do a little bit of tape here, a little bit of tape here. If you do that, as you paint, your canvas is going to curl up. It's going to want to come off the cardboard. You'll not be happy. So, all right, I'm going to begin by trying to get it even. I'm going over the canvas a little bit. You don't have to go hugely over it, right? You can just cover that lip a bit. Okay. And I'm trying to keep it straight as well. Now I'm not going to press that fully down yet. First what I'll do is I'll make sure that the tape is securing to the canvas itself. Okay. And then I'm going to start from the middle, press down hard and out. And what we're trying to avoid when we're putting these canvases down is creating any bubbles either in the tape or in the canvas itself. Alright, so now I'm going to go over to the opposite side and I'm going to be pressing the tape and pressing the canvas out and down like this. Again, I want to try to keep this canvas as flat as possible, avoiding bubbles. I do not want my canvas to start to bubble up as I paint. Then you'll have to retape it down, and that can be aggravating. So you want to avoid aggravating stuff. So first, securing it down onto the canvas itself, going from the middle out. Okay. Then going from the middle of the canvas and pressing out. Okay. And then rubbing over that tape. Same thing on the other sides. And again, don't skip out on the tape here. Just fully cover each side. Have a bit of overlap. That's going to save you more time and honestly more tape, because if you tape it down badly, you're probably just going to have to retape it. So canvas first. And from the middle, pressing hard out. Take your time, try to get it flat. Okay. Canvas first, then through the middle, out. Okay, and then just go over that tape one more time on all sides. Alright, so that's taping down your canvas. What we'll be doing throughout the entire class is taping down canvases like this and then toning them with a mid-tone gray to prepare them for different painting projects. Now, value scales. So like I said, you need at least 10 different, we're going to do 10 different values, right? So I'm going to do 10 different lines going this way. So I'm just going to measure that. I'll start by rotating this. Now, if you don't measure it out and you're not making it super pretty, I honestly don't care. That's fine. What I care about is seeing your value scales with 10 different distinctive values. That is what you're going to be graded on. And you'll be graded on the paint applications. So if your lines are a little wobbly, try not to make them wobbly, but I'm not going to penalize you for that. Alright, I'm going to do the other side, or I'll go to about right here. Now we're going to start off with 4 different columns that we'll be addressing in black and white with 4 different paint applications. But we will add to this later in the semester, so you'll have more room over here. Just feel free to bring these 10 different rows farther down because we will continue to add to it. So you can just go ahead and make those different columns now. Okay, so 10. Alright, let's bring these lines across. So we are doing this value scales project, one, because understanding value is really essential to observational painting in particular, and then also because as we start to paint different things, we'll be working from still lifes quite a bit, and as our painting subject matter gets more and more complex, we're still always going to be mixing different value scales to address those various paintings. So the skill that you're developing now is going to be really essential in the class. We'll be doing tons of paint mixing and mixing out distinctive values for ourselves to use in the paintings. So, 10 different rows. Okay, last one. Okay, and let's just double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Great. And it's actually great that there's a little bit of space down here, because then down here I'll be able to write the different paints and colors that I was using to get these combinations. Obviously right now we're just working with ivory black and titanium white, but we will be introducing colors as we move forward in the semester. Now to get my columns going the other way, I'm just going to trace my ruler. So I'll line that up and I'll just trace this. And I'm gonna do, you need to do at least 4 columns for these different paint applications. But you can trace out more because again we'll be adding to these as we start to introduce color later in the semester. Okay, so I'll stop there. I can finish that off later. Next up, we're going to talk about paint application, and you'll see me painting this out.
Here's my taped down canvas with the rows from my value scales. The canvas should be completely flat with no bubbles or wrinkles. Make sure you have at least 10 rows for the 10 steps of our value scale and 4 columns for the 4 different paint applications. Mixing demo. This is the mixing demo sped up. Make sure you check out the full-length mixing demo, which has been separately uploaded. In that mixing demo, you can follow along and mix with me in real time. I begin by mixing out a mid-tone gray, which I then use to mix out the light ends and dark ends of my value scale. Watch the video and be strategic in how you mix. Avoid trying to mix each value separately from pure black and white.
Okay, one last thing to go over before I start the paint application demo. So first, I have my medium out here. Now I've already painted, so the paint looks maybe a little bit messier. Don't worry about that. What I want to show you is how to use the medium. So if you're starting to paint, you can get some paint on your brush, right? And you go to paint and say it feels kind of dry. Well, you can take some of that medium, get that medium on your brush, and then work it into your paint. You can take it onto your palette and kind of work the paint into your brush, and then apply that to the canvas and see how that feels. You only want to be adding a little bit of medium, so you shouldn't be adding big chunks into your paint. You're just dabbing your brush into the medium, adding it to your paint, smoothing that out on your palette surface before you apply it, so you don't have just chunks of medium coming out on the canvas, okay? You want to smooth that medium into the paint. And then another thing, you can kind of see this, so I went along my palette and I just painted and I put these numbers for the values that each of these piles of paint is. Because we have 10 values, it can be easy to get lost as you go along and to accidentally paint the wrong value in a spot. So I just went in with the black paint, got a little black paint, and I went in and drew in the numbers for each of these. So I really recommend doing that for yourself. Alright guys, if you have any questions as you're working on this about how the paint feels, go ahead and send me a message. Okay everyone, I'm going to demonstrate these different painting application techniques, and these are painting applications that we will later apply to some much more complex projects. We're going to start with a hard edge painting application. I'm going to be using this flat brush for that because it has that nice flat hard edge to it. Okay, we're also going to do a blending painting application, so you're going to blend all of those edges together. You could use either your flat brush or perhaps your filbert, which has more of a rounded edge at the top. Okay, we're gonna do a scumble. Scumbling means dry brush technique, so you could use the filbert's gonna be a nice one for that. Especially if it isn't packed with paint, you want to keep it drier for the scumble. And then impasto is a thick paint application, and we're actually going to apply the paint with our palette knife to really cake it on there. I'm going to start by demoing each of these different paint application techniques a little bit so you can see, and then I will finish out the video with a time lapse of just completing the whole value scale. Now, a few things to keep in mind as we do this project. You've mixed out your value scale and then you're applying it here, and you want to make sure that these different values read as distinctive as you're painting them out. So if you have values that maybe on your palette looked one way, but then on your canvas really don't look distinctive from each other, that gives you a clue that you need to remix that a bit and readdress it. Okay, so keep that in mind. I also have my paper towel out the ready to wipe off my brush as I go, and I even have some vegetable oil at the side as well. If I really need to clean a brush out, I can use the vegetable oil to do that. Okay, so let's begin with our hard edge technique. Okay. So first I'm going to begin with pure white, so that's going to be the zero value. So this is a scale going from 0 to 9, so 10 different steps. And I'm smoothing the paint out on my palette, and I'm adding a little bit of my painting medium. Okay, so hard edge technique, so you want to fill in that little box and you're kind of tracing the edge of your flat brush right up to that little box. If you're doing another painting with hard edges, you're just going to, you have your shapes and then you're tracing up your brush right up to that shape. And the flat brushes are going to be really good for this. Round brushes are going to be really good as well because you can almost use them like a drawing utensil, and so you can get out really distinctive lines. Okay, so now I'm going to wipe that white off of my paintbrush as I go down to my next value. So I'm going to grab some of my lightest gray on here. So between every value that you're going to get on your brush, you want to make sure you've wiped off your brush thoroughly before you start adding new paint into your brush so that other previous value isn't coming through. Okay. So I'm using that flat edge to create those hard edges. And if the paint is feeling really chunky on your brush, you can always take your brush down to your palette and kind of smooth it out. I will show you what that looks like too. Okay, so hard edges, you want these little distinctive squares. Okay, let's do one more. So again, wiping off that paint before I go into my next paint pile where I'll be going a step darker. Now we are creating a 10-step value scale. There are all different types of value scales. So some are just 5 steps or 7 steps. The point of a value scale is that you're understanding that we have these different values going from light to dark, and those are going to apply directly to different objects that we're trying to paint. And we will talk more in depth about how that connects to light logic and value structure. And what we're going to learn this semester is how these different values that we're identifying can connect to different shadows that we're seeing and lights that we're seeing on objects. And what you're going to learn to do is to start to look at a scene, consider a scenario. Oops, I went one step darker. Consider a scenario and then ask yourself what value you see, and you can think of your value scale. Okay, so got these little distinctive squares with these hard edges. So hard edge, use your flat brush. Hard edges in general, flat brush is going to be a good idea, or a round brush. And a round brush, let me show you really quick what that looks like. So this is a very large round brush, but there are some smaller ones too. It comes to a point up here. So you can use it almost like almost like a pencil because you can create fine lines, especially with smaller ones. That one you're going to create larger lines. Okay, blending. Now I'm actually just going to stick with my flat brush for the blending. And I'm actually going to start with a similar approach, but then I'll blend these areas in between. So let's begin with our pure white again. So I'm going to be sure to fill in that square with some pure white. And I'm actually going to bleed this white down a little bit into the next square, because this area in between is what I'm going to want to be blending. Okay, now I'm going to go a step darker into my number 1 value, and that is the lightest gray that you've mixed. Okay, and I'm going to start to put some of this down. I'll also bleed it down into there. I'm going to bring it into that white paint. Okay, now what you can also start to do is actually wipe off your brush a little bit so it's not loaded with paint, and you can go in and blend the wet paint that's on your canvas together. Okay, all right, next value, so we're gonna go a step darker, and let's actually bring a little bit more of this light gray down a little bit so we have something to blend into. So with blending, what you're going to notice is I'm putting wet paint down, and I'm blending that wet paint together. So another way of thinking about this blending is that it is wet into wet paint. Okay, going a step darker, still in my light grays. So start with this one down in here. Get a little bit of medium in my paint, so some of that solvent-free gel. Okay, so, and I'm trying not to go into my other value scale. I'm trying to keep these distinctive. All right, so now again, I'm gonna wipe off my brush a bit. I'm gonna go into these areas, and I'm really softly touching the surface. If you're really pressing down, that can actually just rub off some paint entirely. So you want to be kind of softly dragging your brush over. You can see I'm changing directions too. So I'm blending that paint together. Wet paint into wet paint. Okay, that is blending. Now for scumbling, I'm going to go to my filbert brush. You could scumble with a flat brush, but I just want a brush that isn't loaded up with paint, because scumbling is all about dry brush. So your brush shouldn't be loaded up with paint or with medium. It should be fairly dry, and I'm really gonna work the paint out as I go into these other areas. Okay, and you can get the paint thicker on your brush. So the white, you're not gonna see super clearly, and it feels very different than blending. The blending is more wet into wet paint. This is very dry paint. And so if you feel your brush dragging, that's actually what you kind of want, because that means the brush is dry. Okay, let's go a step darker. Now that's actually quite a bit of paint on my brush. I'll maybe get some of that out, but then I'm gonna wipe this paint off of my brush, get it drier, and then use that to scumble this out. So scumbling is really good for building up atmospheres It has kind of a fuzzy look to it. All of these different ways of applying paint are really good for different things, right? So blending is good for a really smooth kind of object. Scumbling is really good for building up atmosphere. Okay, let's go one step darker. And again, working that out of my brush. If it feels too wet, I want to feel, here you can really see that, you want to feel that dry canvas, and you're kind of scrubbing the paint into the canvas. So it has a really different feel. And you might see even little bits of the white canvas coming through. That's okay. You do want to get the overall value set in there, but especially with the scumble, it's okay if you're seeing little bits of canvas coming through. Let's do one more on that scumble so you can see it a little bit more clearly. Scumbling can be a little clearer on a white surface like this with a darker color. So go to our next one. Working that paint out, keeping it dry, I'm feeling the brush really drag on the canvas. It shouldn't feel smooth, so scumbling is dry brush. Okay, alright, so you can see that looks kind of like a little rain cloud. That's what we're going for on a scumble. Alright, and finally, the last painting application technique that we'll do for this assignment is going to be impasto. And rather than applying the impasto with a brush, I'm actually going to move to my palette knife, and I'm going to be caking on that paint like this. So you're trying to keep it within the square, but impasto, the whole point is that it's really thick paint. And impasto can be really great for, like, if you're trying to paint frosting, you can literally be caking this paint onto the surface and make it look like frosting or look like a cake. We will look at lots of examples of artists that use impasto in really interesting ways. So impasto is thicker, and you can leave it textural like that. That's part of the fun and the joy of impasto. All right, let's do a couple more values of impasto so you can see that. What you're also going to find as you do this project is that in each value scale, you're applying the exact same values, the same values that you mixed out. But the way that you apply paint can affect the way that the value registers. So, for example, blending things out can really make it kind of sink into the surface, and especially with darker paint, it can make it really go in and recede. Impasto is the opposite. So impasto is very thick and textural, and we have these little ridges of paint coming up, and those ridges of paint capture light and make it look lighter. So in darker paint, especially if it's applied in impasto, it's going to look lighter than it actually is, and the value of the paint itself actually is, because of the way that it's been applied. So that is some knowledge that we're going to gain from this project, and that we will definitely be applying into future projects, because you'll really want to think about how you're applying the paint for different objects, for different parts of objects. So you wouldn't want to, for example, to apply impasto or really thick paint into a shadow area. It's going to make that come forward and kind of ruin the effect. All right. Let's do one more. one last impasto. And you kind of have to be careful with your palette knife. It's easy to just wipe paint everywhere, so take your time. Always just take your time and fill in the squares completely, so there shouldn't be big chunks of white coming through, because you want to be able to compare all these different values. And if you have little white halos, well, that effect kind of is ruined. Okay, all right. So there's impasto. So there's a demonstration on these different paint application techniques. Now I'll do a quick time lapse of mapping in the whole value scale. And as always, if you have any questions, just let me know.
Fill out your value scales once you have a handle on the different ways of applying the paint. Fill the values in each square completely. Don't leave any big white spots or white halos. You want to be able to see that gradient. Notice how the same values can look different depending on how the paint is applied. Squint at your value scales. You should be able to distinctly see a dark to light gradient.
Alright, here are our finished value scales in black and white with 4 different paint applications. We have hard edge, blending, sort of continuous tone blending, scumbling, and impasto. So as you're putting the paint down for each of these applications, it's going to feel a little bit different. With the hard edge, it should feel pretty smooth on your brush. To get those hard edges, you're going to want quite a bit of paint, a little bit of medium, get that flowing, get that nice crisp edge. Same thing with the blending. You want the paint to feel smooth because you're putting wet paint into wet paint, then softly going over the top, manipulating it, blending it together, smoothing it out. Scumbling, very different, so it should feel very different. Scumbling is dry brush, so you should feel a kind of drag on your brush. You're feeling the dryness of the canvas, which means you have to, if it's feeling too smooth, get some paint out of your brush with your paper towel, okay? And finally, impasto, that's a lot of paint, and you can use your palette knife to kind of literally cake that on, so think of frosting as you're doing impasto. Also guys, just want to point out again, I have additional rows over here. We're going to return to these value scales later in the semester and do value scales with different colors. So just go ahead and put those rows and columns farther out and save the value scale project to return to later in the semester.